So, Renaissance, well, when was it? It's a period of time in art, not so much in history, but there's still disagreement on exactly when it was, so we'll just peg out a rough period for where the Renaissance was. A lot of people say it started with Giotto because he was a humanist artist, one of the very first, and then ended with Michelangelo, and I think that's somewhat of an appropriate thing because Michelangelo died in the year that Galileo was born, and Galileo is thought of as the transitional figure to the early modern period in science. Another transitional figure, but this time for mathematics, is Girard Desargues. He's often called the founding father of projective geometry. And he's around that time, so let's say 1600. And then other people will say that Renaissance actually began between this competition to make the doors for the baptistry in Florence by Ghiberti and Brunelleschi. There was the panel, the committee couldn't decide. So they said, okay, both of you you both do it. And Brunelleschi didn't want to work with anyone else. So he said, nope, you can do it, Ghiberti. I'm fine with that. But it took a really long time to do. So Ghiberti spent many years making these beautiful doors, which meant that Brunelleschi could concentrate on other things. And so that was a pivotal time. You'll see in a second why. There's some other things that will help you understand this period of time. There's some famous events. These are randomly chosen. The bubonic plague went through Europe, didn't affect Italy as much as perhaps other parts of Europe. And then there was also the Medicis, a wealthy family, moving into Florence, starting the first bank and trade system. The printing press was a major development in the 15th century, and then you had social upheaval and the movement of people in the 1600s, which helped spread some of the knowledge out from northern Italy to the rest of Europe. And the Reformation had something to do with that. The greatest technological achievements of the Renaissance was printing, undoubtedly. And I assert that the greatest mathematical achievement was perspective, bar none, right? Algebra didn't come close, or any of those other subjects we like to study in mathematics. It was really in perspective that the change came. So when I gave my course to the students, there was a lot more other stuff that I can't talk about today. So we had to talk about what came before the Renaissance: Arabic mathematics, Indian mathematics, optics, the trade culture that flourished in Florence, the discovery of alum, the demand for silk and wool, all these sorts of things that helped create this hive of activity in Florence. But I can't cover all that today. Okay, so just pointing out to the experts, there is a lot more that I'm not saying today. It's incredibly interesting though, and I didn't know about all this stuff, so I will also list some texts and some books and some articles at the end of the talk, which are really great to read on this subject, on both the history and also the mathematics and perspective art. Okay. So here is you can't read it, but that's okay. It's a diagram which shows a timeline of a very short period, say 1300 to 1550, of famous mathematicians. And this is a fairly reliable resource that mathematicians know about. It's from Sid Andrews, and it's a database of famous mathematicians, whatever that means. The horizontal lines denote a lifespan of the mathematician whose name is on top of that line. Blue lines are for European mathematicians, and black lines are for Arabic mathematicians, and red lines for Indian mathematicians. And you can see that there is a lot of blue there, but if you were to go to the left and look at the previous diagram, you would have a lot of black and red, okay? Now, I'll zoom in a little bit. So this is 1400 to 1550, a little bit more readable now. And you can see Chiusa, Alberti, Francesca, they're probably better known as artists and philosophers than they are as mathematicians. And there's a few others there. I'll just let you soak it in. Leonardo da Vinci is in the middle there. Okay, so some of these names, even mathematicians wouldn't know them very well. So this is perhaps a super list of what we think of as the famous mathematicians of this period. So anyway, the point is that it makes it so much more feasible to study the history of this time. If I were to try and do this in the 1700s, it's an explosion of mathematicians. It takes forever to understand one small morsel of what was done in that period. Whereas here, you feel like you can understand it. Perspective in art. Here is a picture that's in the Sistine Chapel. Some art by Perugino. It's not perfectly done mathematically, but it's a very good portrayal of a three-dimensional picture in 2 dimensions. You can see that there is this pavement with transversal lines, these grid lines, and you can see these other lines, which are called orthogonals, which converge somewhere at the horizon, somewhere in the middle of that door in the central building. Some of you will also know that this central building looks a lot like the baptistry in Florence. The perspective goes wrong if you just consider the other buildings. That's the simplest way. The other 2 buildings are completely out of whack in perspective. Anyway, it's quite good. And you can see if you draw those lines in that they converge to the vanishing point, as it's often called. Okay? So this is back in 1482. So this illustrates what we call one-point perspective, or something like that, okay? We say that there's this central point, but there are actually more points in this picture where other lines converge, so it isn't really strictly a one-point perspective. Okay. The next one is by Uccello, if I pronounce it right. Yeah, Uccello, sorry. It's earlier, and he was obsessed in perspective. He went to great effort to really achieve the illusion. He was a student of Ghiberti, and he did a pretty good job with this chalice, I guess. And there's a few other well-known paintings of his. Some of them look a little cartoon-like, okay, so look a little flat, but still an impressive exponent of perspective. Advances in maths of perspective foreshadowed projective geometry. I've already mentioned this. So the desire to make something better, to make a better, more realistic picture or drawing, drove a better, well, they sought for a better understanding of what made it tick. They went beyond just trying to, well, first of all, they made instruments. Okay, so back in the early Renaissance, they made instruments to try and I'll talk about this in a second, to try and get, to make their perspective pictures more accurate. And then to understand it better, they sought for mathematical understanding. And the critical figures that I'm going to mention today, though there are a lot more, Brunelleschi, Alberti, I'll say Piero, they often call him by his first name, and Guerra Baldo. And they are at different periods of time. Now, there's some other names down there, so for the people in the audience who are experts, I will not be mentioning them, but they are very important, I agree. They are very important. All right. There should be 2 L's in Uccello. All right. Now, here is the idea. You have 2 planes. I think of it as 2 planes, but some people would say, oh, you have some object that's 3-dimensional and you want to make a 2-dimensional thing. Let's simplify that and just say we want to draw a 2-dimensional object on another 2-dimensional object. And you can think of this point in the middle there, which is called the center of the projection, as being your eye, okay? And I've got it in between the 2 planes. That seems a bit strange. So you might want to have the canvas in front of you and the object over there. To us, it won't matter. Mathematicians are very happy with moving these things around. It doesn't matter where the planes are. It does matter in some sense that there are different types of projection, okay? There are different types of projection. I'll say a little bit about that, but I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty. But this is perhaps the most mathematically interesting form of projection. It's the most natural. It's the one that you think of with monocular vision. And it's the one that you use to make pictures. So you need an object plane, the thing that you want to draw, and the picture plane is the drawing. So that's the jargon for the talk. That's about the only jargon in the talk, okay? All right. Mathematically interesting. So this is a little bit mathematical, this bit. This is the high point of the talk, I guess. So central projection is not a Euclidean invariant. What does that mean? Well, it breaks some of the rules. So orthogonal projection, if you happen to know what that is, it's taking orthogonal lines that are parallel and taking your points of your picture and orthogonally mapping it onto your other picture. That would actually preserve angles. So angles are not preserved. You can see this square here, which has 90 degrees around at its corners, goes to something that doesn't have 90 degrees around in its corners, okay? Goes wrong. So keep that in your mind. So here I've drawn the object plane and the picture plane to be at right angles. That wasn't my idea, that was actually Alberti's idea. He did this in his book, okay? It simplifies, it makes it easier to see what's going on, and that's what I'm going to do in the talk. So it seems a bit strange that I would do that, but Albertis Window, for example, he was talking about in his book, I'll talk about this later, looking at things outside and seeing where they appear on the floor in his studio, the light coming from outside on the floor and things like that. So it's a little bit like Albertis Window. It's not an affine invariant, that's the next step up. If you abandon nice things, you go to the next nice thing, which is affine invariance. And parallel projection, if you know what that is a form of affine map. And here it disobeys preserving midpoints. So if I go halfway between those two points here, then where it goes is not halfway between where those 2 points were going to, okay? It's not halfway, so it goes wrong. So it doesn't preserve ratios of lengths, hardly anything you like. But what it does preserve is ratios of lengths. That's called the cross ratio in geometry, but don't worry about that. That's a projective invariant, and that's why I like it. All right, so it's very interesting. Okay, so pavimento. So this is where you put some tiles on the floor in a grid-like way to create the illusion of 3D, okay? This is very common in the work of the Renaissance. Here's a very early, this is before Brunelleschi. One of the Lorenzetti brothers was quite, he liked pavimento. This isn't the only one. And it goes wrong. If you analyze this, you see that the lines don't converge very well, but it was an attempt to put some depth into the picture. Pavimento is important also for Alberti's grid construction for perspective, which I'll talk about later. So, Brunelleschi, he wasn't an artist per se, but he was more a goldsmith, architect and sculptor. And he made a work of art which doesn't exist today, but is told about in a biography by Manetti. And it's a 30 centimetre by 30 centimetre panel of a drawing of the baptistry in Florence. There it is, that's today. That's not a painting, that's a photo. And it's an octagonal building, so it's quite striking if you try and draw it. It really shows off perspective. And what he thought of doing was he took a wooden panel, it's small what he's going to make here, and he puts a hole in the middle where the door is actually. It's very, very small, so you can look through it. Now, there's some debate over whether he was facing the building or facing away from it, but I'll go with the second one. He would face away from the building and have a mirror in front of him as well. So he'd look through the painting, through the hole, and see the mirror, so you could see the building behind him, and then he would look to see whether what he was drawing was lining up with the building. Or alternatively, you could face in this direction at the building, but then you'd have a reflected image of anyway. So you could look at it this way, and you could do the same thing, but you would have it directly in front of the building, the mirror, and you'd have the painting. You move the painting out of the way, the mirror out of the way, sorry, and you're still looking through the hole. You see the building, you see the picture, but the picture's now facing away from me, right? So I hold the picture on my face, and I'm looking through the hole, and I've got a mirror here. I can see the picture. Now I don't. I see the baptistry. Anyway, they're the two accepted versions of events. And Brunelleschi was also a dominant figure. He was a mentor for many other people in that period. So we think of perhaps he was, he gave birth to the perspective movement, but of course it existed in some extent before him. But this obsession he had in trying to make it better was what he transcended to the other people around him. Well, before I get to that, sorry. He sought for this for the very first time, he was looking at a point of view, right? So there's a point of view being incorporated into the picture, okay? So, and this was the main thing about what he was trying to create. And nowadays, what we do is when we learn about perspective, we learn of it as a way of maybe seeing, positioning yourself in the best place possible to achieve a better viewing of that three-dimensional picture. So, you know, you want to understand where the distance point is and everything, and then you stand in the right spot and you can see it looks the most realistic. Well, he was actually, we're surrounded constantly by film, photography, and TV. It doesn't seem like, it seems obvious to us how to interpret a three-dimensional picture onto a two-dimensional canvas. But at the time, this was a learned skill, right? This had to be developed. It was very, very difficult. Okay, so the desire to naturally represent a scene as it appears from a particular viewpoint, okay? So a natural picture, a realistic picture, is a necessary precondition for the invention of perspective, okay? In order to get there, you have to want to have this ambition. Before I get to Alberti, there's this quote. It's rather long, so I want to go through it. It's in Carsten Harries' book. What explains this relationship between mathematicians and painters? The answer is obvious in Alberti's case. His interest in mathematics is tied to the help it can give the painter in his attempt to master illusion, where the word mastery is meant to suggest two things. Both to be able to produce convincing representations of the world as we see it, but also to have understood the logic of these illusions, see what makes it tick. The theory of perspective teaches us about the logic of appearance of phenomena. Practice here turns to theory, not for the sake of insight into the true nature of things, but for the sake of mastery, to get good at it. Having delimited his concerns, Alberti proceeds to draw a distinction between these qualities of a space that are changed by change of place and light, and those that are not. In this respect, perspectival art is not too different from the new science, which has also its centre in measure in the perceiving subject. So this is where we get the idea that this subject was bringing about some sort of scientific thought, okay? That's why it was so important. So Alberti, he wrote the book on painting, Della Pittura, or De Pictura, in 1435. And he, for the first time, was writing just about making good constructions in perspective art. A manual actually. It's written completely in imperatives. You do this, you do that, you do this, all the way through. It's a manual for making constructions, and he knew that lines went to lines. So here is a line, and then I see what happens to it under the projection, and hey presto, it goes to another line. And so he knew that. That was quite sophisticated for the time. Lines parallel to the ground line, these ones here, this is not an animation now, this is just a still. They go to a line over here, which is parallel with this line. Orthogonal lines go to converging lines. So when you map these over, you actually see that they meet. And Edgerton actually calls this book Windows 1435, and there's another book which is something like Alberti to Microsoft, or something like that. And because it was a technological advance, I suppose, in a series of technological advancements. So then there were workshop methods. These are some pictures of Albrecht Durer. You might have seen these before. We have Albertis Window, an impression of what that means on the right. Looking at a grid and translating a grid to another grid, or looking through a veil, or looking through a canvas somehow, and drawing straight lines between the object and what you want to draw. Okay, so this is a picture by Piero Della Francesca. It's a good one because he's in it. He's right here. There he is. Anyway, so slowly attention turned from workshop methods of producing perspective to the reasons why it worked. Okay, and that's the connection with geometry. So this is the in-between of Alberti and Della Francesca, because Alberti wanted to have a reliable way to do perspective drawing, and this is in his book, but he makes some, let's say, approximations of the truth, okay? So, for example, later on, you'll have these transversals that recede to the horizon. In his book, he said that they should be at a ratio of 3 to 2, and that's not right. It depends. Okay, but there's some approximations to the truth that he has in his book. Now, so what am I doing here? Well, our point over on the left-hand side at the horizon is going to be our point of vanishing point, our center where all the converging lines go to infinity. So you can imagine I could be drawing a pavement or train tracks or something like that. Now, what you do is you fix another point on the right-hand side, and you attach it to each of these points down the bottom that are equally spaced. And then you take the intersection of those lines with your orthogonal lines, and they tell you where to put these parallel lines. If you draw more of them, the more accurate this is. So you continue this. It doesn't matter where you put these lines, they will all go through the same point. Now, that was a rule in Piero's book. It was a rule that this would work, but he didn't know why. So it's quite interesting. You do this yourself. Draw the image under perspective of a grid, and then check that all the diagonals go through the same point. It's a good way to check if perspective is correct in a picture. They should all go through the same point over there. Okay, so Piero, he wrote De Prospera Pingendi, I don't know how to pronounce that properly, which is also another book on the mathematics of linear perspective, but this time he's really a mathematician. He knows what he's doing, but he still doesn't get to everything. There's things missing in his book. So he knows about these 45-degree lines, these diagonals going through the point. He knows about that. He knows about what would happen if you traced a curve by constructing points on it. You know, we know now that 5 points or so would make an ellipse. You can make a unique ellipse on 5 points, but he discovered this. He gave a proof that these orthogonals would converge to the same point. So he's now doing mathematics and convincing mathematics. And anamorphosis appears, and I'll say that more later. Now, the theorem that I'm running a theorem there, that's what we do, mathematicians. It's a theorem fact, undeniable fact, that the following properties hold. So part A, which I attribute to a few different people, is that the image of a line of the object plane, so look at the left-hand side, parallel to the picture plane is going to be cast to a line that's parallel to this line of intersection. We call this the ground line, this one here. Okay, so that's known. But more than that, if you take the image of a line of the object plane not parallel this time. It's not parallel, so it has to come along and hit your ground line. That will go to a line, but it has a hole in it. And I'll say more about this in a minute. Think about this. Which points don't go to that blue plane? Which points of the orange plane do not go to the blue plane? Conversely, which points of the blue plane do not come from points of the orange plane? So while I'm waffling on, you can think about that. So there are points missing, and that's called the vanishing point. So here it is. Here's helps you imagine what's going on. As it's a bit fast, and it's a bit grainy actually, but hopefully you can still understand it, that as I move that point further and further up this line to the right, it gets closer and closer, but never gets to the intersection of the black and orange line. It looks like it does, but it doesn't. It never gets there. Otherwise, this green line through the point P would be parallel with the orange plane. It would be parallel. They wouldn't meet. So that's the vanishing point. You can't get there. And that's very important for us mathematicians. This idea that there are points at infinity is what brought about projective geometry. And the second of my questions, if I had have brought the point closer and closer underneath P so that the green line was parallel to the blue plane, they would never go to the blue plane. So there are points that I can't project. Now, Guerra Baldo was the most mathematical. He was a student of Comandino, and he put all the open problems to rest. He resolved the whole lot. He was rich, and in fact, he's responsible in some sense for the success of Galileo. He supported him quite a bit. And I've already mentioned him in the previous results. He actually proved these things mathematically, that this works. So the vanishing point theorem is due to him. It's basically this. If you have a whole lot of lines that are parallel down here, then they will pass through the same point. Now, my animation is just showing you what happens to a line that's not parallel and then eventually becomes parallel. And you can see the effect that it has. It goes to that point, all right? So, so it's somewhat counterintuitive. When I was teaching the students this, they didn't really believe this stuff. I'd ask them this question, what happens to parallel lines? And they said, oh, it went to parallel lines? And I go, no, do it. And then they see that it meets in a point. And they know this because they know that railway tracks look like they meet at the horizon. So if you look at the other plane, you turn it upside down also, then it looks like rail tracks. So this line that I forgot to mention that goes across where that point is called the vanishing line, or the horizon. Now you can't really see these planes very well. There's a pink plane here and a blue plane there, but it shouldn't matter too much here. So it's basically saying almost the same thing, which is that if you take a line that's not parallel, then you can actually determine the line by taking the point of intersection of that line with the pink plane down the bottom, the foot of it, right down the bottom, and then seeing where the vanishing point is, and you only need those 2 points to make the line. That's another thing they knew. Anyway, this is what we were teaching in first year. So what happens to a triangle? So here's an animation. So the colours haven't come out very well, but you can still see the 2 planes there, hopefully. So as the top vertex of the triangle, the top corner of the triangle, gets closer and closer to this line, which is actually the intersection of the line parallel to the blue plane through the green point, okay? So that's what it is. As it gets closer and closer to it, it looks like it forms an infinite rectangle. And that's what's actually happening. The 2 sides of the triangle become parallel. And then it becomes a triangle again, but flipped over, okay? So there's a bit of fun you can do with this, see what would happen. Here's another one. This one's my favourite. What happens to a circle? So if I take a circle, it goes to an ellipse usually. It goes to an ellipse. It's not a circle. But then when it crosses this line, funny things happen. When it crosses the line, it becomes a hyperbola. hyperbola like that, okay? When it exactly meets the line, which you'd have to, if you blink, you won't see it, it actually becomes a parabola. So you get all three conic sections by playing with the circle and seeing what happens to it under perspective. All right, there you go. Boom. Okay. Anamorphosis to finish off. This is about seeing what happens when you do perspective twice. So you've been looking at pictures of perspective. So you're doing perspective twice, all right? So perspective painters wanted to muck around with these ideas, basically. They got to a point where they understood perspective, and there was a bit of a battle to get support from the patrons for commissions for doing projects for work. And so they wanted to impress them with some funny pictures. This is anamorphosis down the bottom here. So someone's put a famous picture from Piero's book on their wall, because that's where anamorphosis first appeared. But if you look at it from a different angle, it doesn't look like a head. Okay, so you've got to be standing in the right place in that corridor for the head to appear. So that's called anamorphosis. And you can also see it in, a lot of people know this picture. It's in the National Gallery in London. Holbein's The Two Ambassadors. So there's this funny thing on the floor. You can probably make out what it is. It's a skull. And if you look at it from the bottom left corner of this page here, oh yeah, it's really good. You should come up after this. It really works. It doesn't work on the computer screen, obviously, but, or you can go to the top right corner, and it looks like that. It really did. I'll do that. You won't get to enjoy it as much as me, but it's just, I mean, that's awesome. All right, so it becomes a skull. So that's very clever. That's amazing. What was the date again? 1533 or something. That's really amazing. Now there's also, you can see this in advertising. This is in the rugby. So some company has put a flat picture on the ground, and it is, you can make it look three-dimensional. These are just ones I stole from the web. There's this one as well, which is pretty cool. And here's another one. You look at it from a different angle and it appears differently. I made this into a tutorial for my class as well. They had to understand Albertis Window, the grid. Okay, so you take a known object that has a form that you really recognize, like Bart Simpson's head, or something like that, or Homer Simpson, it was Homer Simpson, and then you take the coordinates of the grid there and you put it onto your skew grid, and then they have to look at it, usually with your camera, right? If you use two eyes, it doesn't really work very well. If you close an eye, it's better, obviously, for perspective. So you use your camera, and you can see the picture again. It's pretty awesome. Do it at home. It's good fun. So here are the texts I was talking about. There's quite a lot of them, and this isn't even all the ones we were looking at. Most of these I've skim-read, and I haven't read them all, obviously. There's quite a lot of them, but my collaborator, he has read all of them. Now, Judith Veronica Field, she's written some great books on the subject. Also, Kirsty Anderson is someone I found a good read. Paul Johnson, he's more of a historian. And Walker's book is quite good as well. And that's it. Thanks very much.